There's a version of you that shows up in meetings, agreeable, composed, reasonable. And there's another version, the one that surfaces at 11 at night, replaying a slight from 3 years ago, imagining exactly what you should have said. Most people assume the calm version is the real them, and the other one is some strange exception. What if it's the other way around? What if the calm version is the performance, and the messier one is closer to the truth of how humans actually work? That uncomfortable possibility sits at the center of The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. Greene spent years studying historical figures, psychological research, and patterns of behavior across politics, business, and everyday relationships, looking for the underlying mechanics that drive people, regardless of culture or era. His earlier books focused on power and strategy. This one turns the lens inward, toward the emotional wiring most of us would rather not examine too closely, because looking directly at it is uncomfortable, and because most of us have built entire identities around not looking. The book has resonated with such a wide audience precisely because it doesn't flatter the reader. It doesn't tell you that you're the rational, self-aware exception to human nature. It tells you that you're not, and then shows you why that's actually useful to know. The first idea worth sitting with is also the hardest one to accept about yourself specifically, even though it's easy to accept about other people. We like to believe we reason our way to conclusions and then act on them. In reality, it usually runs backward. We feel something first, an urge, a discomfort, a pull toward or away from someone, and only afterward does the mind construct a tidy, logical-sounding explanation for why we felt it. The explanation feels like the cause. It's actually the aftermath. Watch this play out in something as mundane as a hiring decision. A manager interviews two equally qualified candidates and walks away preferring one of them. Ask her why, and she'll cite specifics. Better communication, stronger examples, sharper answers. All of that might even be true. But if you looked closely, you'd likely find the preference formed within the first 90 seconds, based on something far less articulate. How the candidate's energy matched her own, an unconscious resemblance to someone she'd liked before. A tone of voice that felt safe. The reasons came afterward, built to justify a decision the emotional brain had already made. This isn't a flaw unique to bad decision makers. It's how the decision-making architecture works for almost everyone, almost all the time. The people who make better decisions aren't the ones who've eliminated this pattern. They're the ones who've learned to notice it happening in real time and to pause before fully trusting the tidy explanation that shows up right after the feeling. This leads naturally into a second idea, one that explains why people so often behave in ways that seem to contradict who they claim to be. Greene argues that everyone carries a shadow. The parts of ourselves we've decided are unacceptable and have pushed out of conscious awareness rather than actually resolved. The anger we were taught was shameful. The neediness we were told was weak. The competitiveness that didn't match our self-image as a laid-back, easygoing person. None of it disappears just because we stop looking at it. It goes underground, and it finds indirect ways to leak out, usually in moments we'd never consciously choose. Picture someone who prides themselves on being endlessly patient and accommodating, the person everyone describes as easygoing. Colleagues rarely see this person get visibly angry, but they notice something else, a pattern of subtle sabotage. a forgotten email that happened to delay a project they quietly resented being assigned, a joke at someone's expense delivered with just enough plausible deniability to seem harmless. That's the shadow at work. The anger didn't vanish because it was suppressed. It just stopped announcing itself honestly, which is often more damaging than if it had simply been expressed in the first place. Greene's argument isn't that we should indulge every dark impulse. It's that pretending we don't have them doesn't make us better people. It just makes the impulses harder to see coming in ourselves and in everyone around us. From here, the book turns to something almost everyone recognizes instinctively, but rarely names precisely: narcissism. Not as a rare pathology confined to a few extreme personalities, but as a spectrum every single person exists somewhere on. A small amount of healthy self-regard is necessary and normal. It's what lets a person maintain boundaries, pursue goals, and recover from criticism without collapsing. The trouble starts at the far end of that spectrum, where self-regard curdles into something that requires constant external validation just to feel stable, and treats other people less as full human beings and more as an audience. You've almost certainly worked with someone further along that spectrum than they realize. A colleague who can discuss his own achievements at length but visibly loses interest the moment the conversation shifts to yours. A friend who frames every shared experience, even one centered on someone else's milestone, as ultimately about her. Greene's more useful insight here isn't just spotting this in others. It's noticing the same tendency in a milder form in yourself. The flicker of impatience when a conversation isn't about you. The subtle relief when a friend's plan falls through and yours looks better by comparison. The goal isn't guilt. It's simply recognizing that the line between healthy self-interest and corrosive self-absorption isn't a wall between different types of people. It's a dial everyone is standing somewhere along, and it moves depending on stress, insecurity, and how much attention we've been getting lately. Closely related to this is an idea that explains a specific frustrating type of person almost everyone has encountered. The person whose confidence seems to outpace their actual competence by a wide margin and who seems entirely unbothered by the gap. Greene frames this as grandiosity, and he's careful to root it not in genuine self-belief, but in its opposite. Underneath an inflated self-image, there's usually a fragile one, and the inflation exists specifically to keep that fragility from being felt. Think of a manager who reacts to any question about his decisions as though it were a personal attack, who talks over people in meetings, and who seems physically unable to say the words, "I was wrong." This isn't what real confidence looks like. Genuinely secure people can absorb a correction without their identity wobbling. What you're watching is a defense system built to protect something underneath that feels far more uncertain than the surface lets on. Recognizing grandiosity for what it actually is changes how you respond to it. Arguing with the surface performance rarely works, because the performance was never really about the facts in the first place. It was about protecting a self-image too brittle to survive contact with a simple disagreement. There's a quieter, more corrosive pattern the book spends real time on, precisely because it's so rarely spoken aloud, even by the people experiencing it. Envy. Almost nobody admits to feeling it directly because admitting it feels like admitting inferiority, so it hides disguising itself as other, more socially acceptable emotions. Disdain, excessive criticism, a sudden coolness toward a friend right after their success, dressed up as simply being busy. Picture two friends who've been close for years. One gets a major promotion. The other, who would insist she's happy for her friend, notices she's suddenly slower to respond to texts, quicker to find small faults in her friend's decisions, oddly relieved by any minor setback that follows. She's not consciously choosing any of this. It's simply how envy moves when it isn't allowed to speak its own name. Greene's point isn't that you should feel ashamed of envy when it shows up. It's an almost universal human experience arising anytime someone close to us gets something we secretly wanted for ourselves. The danger isn't the feeling. It's what happens when the feeling goes unacknowledged and starts steering behavior from underneath, disguised as something else entirely. Zoom out from individual psychology, and the book turns to something that happens the moment people gather into groups, a pattern Greene treats as one of the most underestimated forces in human behavior. People in groups don't simply add their individual judgment together. They often surrender it. The need to belong, to avoid standing out, to stay aligned with whatever the group's emotional temperature happens to be, quietly overrides independent thinking, even in people who consider themselves strong-willed and immune to peer pressure. You've felt a mild version of this in a meeting where everyone nods along with a plan that, individually, several people privately doubted. Nobody wants to be the first person to raise the objection, because raising it means risking the group's approval, and the fear of that social cost outweighs the discomfort of staying quiet. Multiply that dynamic across a whole team, a whole company, a whole online community, and you get decisions that no single rational person in the room would have made alone, arrived at collectively anyway. Greene's warning here isn't abstract. It's a direct challenge to anyone who assumes their judgment stays fully intact once they're inside a group. It usually doesn't, and the people most at risk are the ones most convinced they're immune. The last thread worth pulling connects back to something the book keeps circling, in different forms, from beginning to end: aggression, and specifically, how rarely it shows up as the obvious, easy-to-spot kind. Most people don't yell. Most conflict in daily life is quieter than that, and far harder to name cleanly, which makes it far harder to defend against. Consider a coworker who never raises his voice, never says anything overtly hostile, and yet somehow leaves you drained and vaguely undermined after nearly every interaction. The backhanded compliment. The favor granted with just enough visible reluctance to make you feel indebted and guilty at once. The critical feedback delivered publicly, framed as helpfulness. None of it is dramatic enough to point to directly. That's exactly the design, whether conscious or not. Greene's argument is that learning to recognize this quieter, indirect aggression for what it is, not misreading it as your own oversensitivity, is one of the more protective skills a person can develop. Because the version of aggression that hides behind plausible deniability is often more damaging over time than the version that simply announces itself. There's one more pattern worth naming before pulling everything together, because it explains something that confuses almost everyone who's ever watched a talented, intelligent person repeatedly undermine their own success in ways that seem to make no sense from the outside. Greene calls attention to a kind of compulsive behavior that operates almost independently of conscious intention, rooted in old patterns formed early and never fully examined. A person doesn't choose, in any deliberate sense, to sabotage a good relationship right when it starts to feel stable, or to pick a fight with a boss right before a promotion is announced. But it happens anyway, on a schedule that starts to look less like coincidence and more like a groove worn into the personality long ago. Think of someone who has, without fail, ended every serious relationship right around the 2-year mark, always for a reason that seems legitimate in the moment. Timing, incompatibility, a sudden character flaw that appeared out of nowhere in an otherwise good partner. Looked at individually, each breakup has its own story. Looked at together, across years and multiple partners, the pattern itself becomes the real story. Something is being repeated, not chosen freshly each time. Greene's suggestion isn't that free will is an illusion. It's that a huge amount of what feels like fresh, independent decision-making is actually compulsion wearing the costume of choice. And the only way out of a repeating pattern is to notice the repetition itself, rather than getting absorbed once again in the specific, convincing details of this particular version of it. Every one of these patterns, taken together, points toward the same uncomfortable but ultimately freeing conclusion. Human behavior is rarely as rational, as transparent, or as fully chosen as we like to believe, in ourselves most of all. We rationalize feelings we don't examine. We bury impulses we've decided are shameful, and they surface anyway. Sideways, we dress envy up as criticism, insecurity up as confidence, and quiet resentment up as helpfulness. None of this makes people villains. It makes them human, running on the same underlying architecture that's shaped behavior for as long as there have been people living close enough together to affect one another. The real value in seeing any of this clearly isn't cynicism about human beings. It's precision. Once you can name what's actually happening beneath a defensive outburst, a sudden coldness, a colleague's brittle confidence, you stop taking it quite so personally, and you stop being quite so blindsided by your own reactions too. Understanding human nature was never really about outmaneuvering other people. It was about finally being able to see clearly in yourself first, and then in everyone standing around you.